everyone, welcome back to Women's Health and Wellbeing Services live streaming every week at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I'm Melanie. How have you been going? Are you still at home? Have you sent your kids back to school? Bit of confusion perhaps around that, whether to send your kids back to school or not. Many people still undecided, but some have gone, yeah, it's time. Others are like, still not sure. It's still a little confusing, I would say, and bit of mixed messages. That's certainly how I'm feeling these days. So anyway, today I'm going to be talking about self-compassion and the new self-compassion group. Well, self-compassion group that we've run here at the service last year, and then I've now converted to an online group that it has 5 modules. So this group is available to do in your own time, at your own pace, in your own space kind of thing, and it's available to purchase through our website. Currently, we're offering quite a big 50% discount on our little groups that we've converted to online groups. The beauty of doing something online, of course, is that it's incredibly flexible. So it gives you, such freedom, I think, in how and when you do the group. You can tick along at your own pace. You can go back over things. I guess it has downsides too, in that there's no live interaction, like right now, for instance, and you're not in a physical group where you can chat back and forth, and sometimes there's such richness that comes from being with a group of people and when you're all on the same page and you're all learning the same things together. So, kind of do what works for you, I suppose, in that regard. We will be going back to real life groups and counselling at some point. We don't know when that is just yet. So for now, we are offering these, I think, fantastic alternatives to do online at your own pace kind of thing. So firstly, I just want to see if anyone could just say hi, if anyone is actually watching and listening to this live stream. It is recorded, and we do then plonk it up on the Facebook page for you to watch back at any time that you want. We do upload them as well on our YouTube channel. Welcome to go check that out, Women's Health and Wellbeing Services. Pretty simple stuff. We might be doing some stuff on Instagram, but we're still just kind of thinking about that because we're all still feeling our way through technology and the online world. It's very exciting, of course, but also has its ups and downs, as many of us have been talking about today, about how when technology goes well, it goes so well, and of course when it doesn't, it really doesn't go well. And you can honestly, sometimes I feel like I've spent hours trying to get things to work, and then you kind of give up, so it can be really frustrating. But anyway, so I'm here to talk about self-compassion. I've had, if you want to ask any questions about this topic, self-compassion, self-kindness, that kind of thing, by all means, fire away in the little chat box it's on the left of my screen. I don't know if it's on the left of your screen, and hit me up with some questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to dive right into it. We have had a couple of other questions just come in through our Facebook page, so that's always a good way to communicate as well. And we might be changing things a little bit in that regard to offer more of a question and answer kind of format, or just invite people to have questions beforehand that I can cover. I'm a counselling psychologist by trade, so my beef really and my understanding is mental health. So hence my talks are going to be more around your mental health, your mental well-being, psychology, therapy, that kind of stuff. So if you have any questions particularly related to the topics or the themes that I'm covering each week, fire away. Or if you have any other suggestions about how you would like this to be, any changes you would like to see, by all means offer some suggestions and we'll see what we can do with that. No one's really saying hi, so I'm assuming that some people are listening but not being interactive, or now's not a good time, hence the beauty of recording this and then we pop it up. You can watch it back at your own time. I certainly know that I go back and watch things in my own time. Like I sign up to, feels like a lot of webinars and stuff like that and live streams. And if I happen to be online at the time, then I watch it. And if I'm not, then I just go back and watch it later, often with a little caption, so I don't have to necessarily listen to it. So whatever, like I said, whatever works for you. So let's start talking about self-compassion. So I'm just going to be covering some of the content that is in the group, the 5-module group, that you can do at your own pace online if that works for you. So one of the first questions that I've had around self-compassion is, what is it? You know, obviously, what the hell's self-compassion? You know, is it being kind to yourself? Is it self-care? Is it like self-esteem? Is it being a little bit too mushy to yourself? You know, what's it all about? So there are a few different kind of definitions around what self-compassion is. One of the main ones that I use in the self-compassion group is a definition put forth by Kristin Neff, who's done a lot of work on self-compassion. She's got some great books on self-compassion, wonderful website on self-compassion, and some questionnaires you can do. If you go to her website, it's Kristin Neff, Kristin, I think, Kristin Neff. If you just look up Kristin Neff self-compassion, even if the spelling's wrong, it'll come up. It's really interesting, I think, to do a little questionnaire and to see how you rate in how compassionate and how kind you are towards yourself. So according to her, there are 3 elements of self-compassion. The first one is self-kindness. So obviously that makes sense, and that really fits with compassion, kindness. They sound really really similar. I suppose they have sort of minute details in the differences. So essentially, self-kindness is being loving towards ourselves. Yeah, it sounds really simple. Oh, you know, loving, okay. And that means not being critical to yourself. That might not be so easy. So there's self-kindness. We have a little look at that. The second element of self-compassion is common humanity. This is a really big one, and I really love this one. So all this is about is remembering that everyone suffers, everyone struggles at some point, perhaps many points in their lives, and that we're never alone. Even though certainly there are times in our lives, I think for all of us, that we feel desperately alone and that we're the only person going through this issue, we're the only person suffering in this way. I guarantee you, though, that you are not. There is some person probably at the exact same time that you're experiencing your pain, somebody else is experiencing their pain. You just don't know who they are, and of course you just don't know where in the world you are. So common humanity is just remembering that we're all human and that we're all in this together, and that we all have joys and we all have really bad lows at times. You're not alone, no one's alone, no one's perfect, but that we're all part of this tribe that we call life, you know, and we're so lucky to be alive, you know. So self-compassion then is self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness, third one. So mindfulness is a big topic, I guess is the word, a concept around these days, action really. Mindfulness is about action. And what mindfulness is about being present in the moment, right now, whatever that moment is for you. Being present with yourself without any judgment. So you're not criticizing yourself, you're not having a go at yourself, going, why am I thinking these things? Why do I keep doing this kind of stuff? All it is, when I say all it is, it's like it's as simple as that, and it's as difficult and as big as that. You know, it's so easy, I think, certainly for me to sit here and talk about, just be kind to yourself and just remember that we're all in this together and practice your mindfulness skills kind of thing. In real life, though, in the day-to-day grind of life, this stuff gets really, really hard and takes compassion. It takes more compassion towards yourself to do these little things each day, to remember these acts of kindness, essentially, that we're trying to build into our lives by being compassionate towards ourselves. So mindfulness is about, like I said, being present in the moment, noticing the struggle that you're in or the joy that you're in. If you're actually practicing a bit of a mindfulness meditation or exercise, you would be possibly just watching your thoughts float by. You would be checking out some feelings that you might be feeling. You might be noticing some sensations in your body, and you would be doing all of this kind of as an outside observer. You would be having some distance from yourself and just watching these processes occur without doing anything, without attacking yourself, without questioning yourself. You just kind of got that kind of distance, and you're in a mindful space. And we can be mindful in many, 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 many different ways throughout our day, throughout our lives. Sure, you can do some meditations and mindfulness practices, but it can be going for a walk really mindfully, just being really aware of where you are and what you're listening to and what you're seeing. You might be doing the dishes mindfully. You might be washing your hair mindfully. And what that means is, in that moment, you're really in that moment. If you're washing the dishes, you might be really mindful of the temperature of the water, of the soap suds, of how many dishes you have. You might then start thinking, oh, geez, I've still got a whole pile of dishes to do. And that's okay, that's what thoughts do. But the point is, you're kind of taking yourself back to that absolute present moment of what's happening for you right then and right there. I could talk forever, I guess, about mindfulness. I think Janet, our health promotion officer, is doing a live stream on mindfulness. I should check out when that is for you, but we're going to be putting them up on our Facebook page anyway. So it's kind of self-compassion. If we were to break it down to those three elements, we're looking at self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So self-kindness, it's about being loving to ourselves, being warm and understanding towards ourselves when we struggle, when we suffer, when we fail, rather than beating yourself up. And someone who acts very compassionately towards themselves recognizes their humanness, is really aware that they're going to fail at times, they're going to stuff things right up. They might not reach certain goals, they might be disappointed, and they recognize and are okay, essentially, with the ups and downs of life. And that, I think, is a very kind act in itself. Instead of always banging your head against a brick wall and going, why does this stuff keep happening to me? This is ridiculous, I can't get anything right. It's very harsh, critical words. And in the course, we actually do cover one of the whole modules is on the inner critic, and this stuff that goes on in our heads, that kind of constant stream. I know for many people there's a constant stream of very critical thoughts, which are kind of the complete opposite of being very self-compassionate. So we do cover that in the course. What else? So in regards to self-compassion, I also talk about in the course what it's not. So I think it's sometimes really easy for people to go, well, isn't self-compassion isn't that really indulgent? Isn't that kind of taking pity on yourself and just being a bit pathetic? No, that's not it at all. Self-indulgence is really a way, self-indulgence in a way that is problematic, right? Would be, say you've had a really hard day and, or you've had an argument or a conflict with someone, and instead of sort of being able to sit with yourself in those feelings and that struggle, which I know is very hard, I still personally really struggle with that sometimes, you just go and indulge in some way. You just go, I'm just going to eat that whole tub of ice cream, or I'm just going to go and drink a whole bottle of wine, or I'm going to smoke this pack of cigarettes, or I'm just going to ignore the problem. And you kind of go, well, that's actually being quite negative to yourself, and obviously not using some good strategies there. Self-indulgence has that kind of tone of sort of anti-compassion, really. If you were to pull it apart and look at that behaviour that you're engaging in, it's probably not really healthy for you. to sit there and eat a tub of ice cream and just binge watch TV for 12 hours a day. You know, so self-compassion is not that. And self-compassion too isn't about pity and being self-pitying towards yourself, because when we engage in a lot of pity, that's kind of about our egos and sort of egocentric feelings that's essentially separate us from other people. We feel very disconnected. We tend to, in that pitied state, remember, we all kind of get into that place of woe is me, and this is the worst thing ever, and no one's ever suffered like this, and it's all about me, really. And so obviously that stance is not a very compassionate place to be in. So self-compassion isn't about self-pity. It's not about excessive self-indulgence. What about self-esteem? This is another question I had. Is self-compassion like self-esteem? And Kristin Neff has a few things to say about this in the course, with the modules that we have online. There's a video in there and she talks really beautifully about those differences. So self-esteem, this is another big term, you know, and another big thing that's kind of thrown around these days. Oh, we have to have high self-esteem, you know, oh, we've got to raise children with really, really high self-esteem, you know. And of course, in a way, we want to all feel good about ourselves. We want to, you know, have a good, healthy balance about our self-perception, okay? The thing with self-esteem, though, typically it's dependent on achievements. It's dependent on outside sources boosting us up to feel good. So, for instance, if my, you know, it's kind of like getting good grades makes me feel like I'm a good person, and that boosts my self-esteem. Or when, you know, when I do something really well, I get rewarded for something, I get praised for something, that makes me feel really good. So therefore I have good self-esteem. Can you kind of see the problem with that, though? The issue with that is when we raise children, so let's talk about children. When we raise children in that way of being dependent on us for praise, it teaches them kind of that we love them for what they're doing. Oh, you're building that really, really well. Oh, you've built 6 of them. Oh, you've passed that test. Oh, you've got an A. Oh, you've run this bar. This is great. I'm just going to, you know, instead of I love you for who you are, regardless of your achievements, regardless of your failures, regardless of any of that muck in our lives, which is going to happen. It's going to happen. So when we're too dependent on, I've got to have high self-esteem, you know, how do I build my self-esteem? And I do that by bolstering myself with all these achievements and stuff like that. And I evaluate myself based on that. When we fail, which is going to happen, when life gets in the way and we really struggle, boom goes our self-esteem. Because it's dependent on an external thing outside of us, some person or people telling us that we're awesome, or, you know, achieving some goal, and that kind of makes us feel awesome. What happens when we don't reach those? The difference then between self-compassion and self-esteem is that when you are mostly in a self-compassionate, I say mostly because no one's perfect, when we're in that self-compassionate zone, when we act that way towards ourselves most of the time, it doesn't matter if we fail the test. It doesn't matter if we didn't get the job. It doesn't matter if we didn't reach that goal, you know. We kind of are kind to ourselves in that moment. We're like, that's a real bummer. You know, I really wanted that. I feel disappointed. I feel a bit upset or a bit sad, but that's okay. I'm still okay. Whereas if you were really focused on self-esteem and you failed at something, you might then really plummet. Your mood would plummet. Your head might be going crazy. I'm such a failure. I'm so useless. This is pathetic. I'm so pathetic. Da, 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 da. You know, we can see how self-compassion comes from an internal space within us that is independent from what's happening outside of us. Whereas self-esteem is more dependent on what's happening outside of us. So in that way, it's more fragile, and you might resonate with that. You might be like, yeah, that makes sense. When I'm really obsessed with what other people think of me, or I'm really obsessed with getting good marks, or I'm really obsessed with achieving this goal at work, or achieving a fitness goal, or millions of different things, or particularly with the online world now and social media and stuff like that, there's so much to compare ourselves to and measure ourselves against all these kind of unrealistic people and achievements outside of ourselves. And if you are basing your self-esteem on that, you're going to run into problems. Whereas if you are always self-compassionate towards yourself, of course there's no problems to have goals and dreams and hopes and stuff like that. Just means that when you don't quite reach them, or when you do, you still feel good. You still feel okay. You feel okay. You kind of muddle your way through that without collapsing into a heap. So that's the difference there between self-compassion and self-esteem. I think that's really interesting, because there's so much sort of obsession with self-esteem, and to a degree that's good and important, but we don't want to breed a bunch of narcissists really that are really obsessed with being better than everyone else, and being too connected and attached to self-esteem breeds that in a way. I hope that makes sense. So what else do I cover in the course? We look at the inner critic, like I mentioned. So I cover what is happening in our heads, and our bodies. So in our bodies, when we're under threat, we activate the threat system. You've probably heard of this, the fight or flight system. And, that's such ancient. That's kind of a combination of biological and ancient. I just made that word up, ancient. It's such a ancient system in our bodies that is necessary for our survival, or it was. So our brain, I go a little bit into the brain and what happens in the brain when the brain gets really triggered by a fearful event in our lives, and that threat system gets activated, and the brain cannot differentiate between what a real threat is, like there's a tiger running towards me, that's a real threat, versus a threat to, say, our self-esteem, or a threat of, I've just had a conflict with my partner or something like that. It actually still activates a lot of the time the same systems in our body, in our brain. So I talk a little bit about that in a bit more in depth than I am now, and about when we are more self-compassionate, we are able to calm the farm a lot more. Our systems are not fried, they're not always on, and I think what it's like to always be on when you're like, I've got to do this and I've got to do that, and I have to, and they're going to think this about me if I don't do this, and I'm just, and that's a very harsh stance to be in, and again, not lending itself well to self-compassion when we're kind of running around doing everything for everyone else. So when we learn to be more self-compassionate and more mindful with ourselves and kinder, we can kind of offset the negative effects of the constant kind of threats that get chucked at us, whether they're real or not. Self-compassion helps us to learn to regulate our emotions as well. And that is just such a key element to living a good, happy, contented life. If you are not able to regulate your emotions well, you probably know what that feels like. It's kind of like being in this washing machine of feelings just getting thrown around all the time, and one little thing will set you off, and then something else will plummet you right down low, and then you're kind of up and down. And when you get upset, you might find it really difficult to calm yourself down, or it might take a long time to calm down, and then you're kind of on this hair trigger and always on alert, and your threat system is always sort of firing kind of thing. So the more you're able to be compassionate towards yourself, the calmer your system will be, and the safer you will feel, and you won't always feel so on guard and kind of terrified of life all the time. So we go into that. We also then look at early life experiences and how they may have played a part in how we are or aren't self-compassionate towards ourselves in the present day. I get you to just have a little think about that, about your early family life experiences. Did you see any acts of self-compassion? Were people generally kind of compassionate towards each other, or was it the opposite? And certainly in some families it is, where kind of beating yourself up and pushing yourself really hard, and toughen the F up, suck it up, princess. That's really promoted and encouraged in some families, in some groups in society for sure, and that does not end well, I can tell you, because that really encourages a suppression of emotions. It discourages talking about feelings, discourages solving problems and solving problems together, and it really encourages you to act in a very critical way towards yourself, because you've learnt to do that and you've internalized that, and then that will show up as this kind of inner critic that never shuts up kind of thing. So on that note of the inner critic, you may have realized by now that you can't stop your thoughts. So thoughts are like a radio station that you can't ever turn off. Hence, when we are able to be more mindful and practice mindfulness, we learn to step back from the radio station and see it for what it is. And we're kind of able to start adjusting the volume a little bit, to use a metaphor. And we're able to watch these thought processes instead of getting caught up in them and believing them to be real. So when we're really harsh and critical on ourselves and we're believing all of that crap that goes on in our head, because we all have it, you blame yourself all the time for everything that's going wrong. You might set yourself up these really high standards that you're never going to meet. You might be very perfectionistic and tell yourself you have to be the absolute best, and if you're not the best, then you're an absolute failure. Again, we kind of see that connection there with self-esteem. That kind of inner critic voice, like I mentioned before, might really exaggerate things in your life, or exaggerate your own weaknesses and your own ways of doing things, and it certainly will tell you that you're pretty stupid, you're pretty silly, you're terrible, you're disgusting, you're useless, there's probably millions of different words that I could use there that you may be familiar with. The thing is that why are we believing that? And we're believing that often because it's all we've ever known. That's just our normal. It's our normal to walk around with our blinkers on, trapped in our own head, in this kind of strange paradox, because you're stuck in your own head, believing all this kind of really harsh stuff, and yet you're also really worried about what other people are thinking about you, and you're also trying to set yourself up to meet these kind of impossible standards and reach all these goals, and I have to reach them because that means I'm good, and da-da-da-da. And you can kind of see, as I'm even talking about that, it kind of winds me up, and I start to go, whoa, that's a lot of pressure. That is some stressful stuff going on in your life. Is that how you want to live your life? It's certainly not how I would like to live my life. I would like to live my life, and I do try to live my life in a lot calmer space, being much more compassionate towards myself, certainly when I stuff things up. Like last week when I was doing the live stream, I don't know if anyone saw it, I completely stuffed up the beginning. I wasn't quite sure with the little intro video, and yeah, it happens. That's just life. It's not the end of the world. So in that moment, I'm just being compassionate towards myself, because I felt awkward. I felt a bit embarrassed. I felt a bit dorky as I stumbled along there. But then I thought, I've seen tons of people online stumble along, and actually it makes me feel better towards them, because I see them being a real person. They're really authentic. They're making mistakes, and they're just getting on with it. And you know what? That's what I'm going to do. So that's what I did. So hopefully today's one is working a little bit better. So I had to kind of come up against my own, the temptation really to engage, to listen to that inner critic of like, oh God, Mel, you really stuffed that up. Like, it's not necessary to say that to me. I'm aware that things didn't quite go well, and here I am trying to do things a bit better. So hence the incredible importance of looking at the thoughts in your head and that criticism that kind of goes on. And on that note, in the course, we also look at your beliefs and how they may be contributing to a lack of self-compassion in your life, and how they may be contributing to bolstering up beliefs about the worth of being critical towards yourself. Because often there's this kind of dual pathway that's kind of going on, where you actually have some pretty positive beliefs about self-criticism and you have some negative beliefs about self-compassion. And we kind of want to swap them. We want to get you thinking some really good stuff, positive beliefs about self-compassion, and some perhaps negative beliefs, or just changing the way we think about self-criticism. So we cover that in the course and how to go about that, some little exercises. The course is quite hands-on with lots of little exercises to get you thinking and really exploring your own mind and your own processes there. On the note of self-criticism, I think it's really easy to think self-criticism is really useful because it helps me get things done. It helps to push me. It helps me to improve myself. So just in that example, there's some positive beliefs a person might have about self-criticism. Also with self-criticism, often people use it to punish themselves, to really beat themselves up about something that they've done. And on that note, I want you to think about the effectiveness of that. When you've done that in your life, has that genuinely been helpful? Has that genuinely moved you closer to where you want to be in your life, or who you want to be as a person? Think about perhaps children. If you have children, or if you know some kids, when they make a mistake or when they hurt themselves or something happens, if you punish them and criticize them and attack them and really have a go at them, does that help them calm down? Does that help them learn to feel okay about their mistakes that they've made? Does that help them keep trying and trying again, or not? Does that make them feel worse? Does that make them want to give up? Does that make them scream louder? Same thing. Doesn't matter if it's a child or you as an adult. Remember, we all have an inner child. So we have a little look at that as well. Then in the group, in the course, we go into a bit more stuff about self-talk, and particularly thought processes, unhelpful thinking styles, or what we would call cognitive distortions. So that's cognitive, just being your head, your thoughts, your thinking. Distortions, obviously, when things are like completely out of whack. So we have a look at those little, say, mistakes in thinking, and we look at unhelpful thinking styles, quite a common strategy to use when, say, somebody comes into therapy and we start working on something. So often we have a little look at unhelpful thinking styles, which we all have. We all have some more than others, and some styles more than others, and some are louder and quieter at different times of our lives. So what do I mean by that? Unhelpful thinking styles. So an example is catastrophizing. You may have heard that. Term. You may do that yourself. You may know someone who does that. So when we catastrophize something, we completely blow it out of proportion. So say something minor happens, say a blind breaks in your home, right? A curtain or something like that. And instead of going, that's a bit of a bugger, kind of really need that curtain, and oh gosh, I'm going to have to fix it now. Instead of that is this kind of completely, this is the worst thing ever. Freaking curtain has broken. How am I going to cope with this? What am I going to do? How am I going to fix it? How am I going to... Blah, blah, blah. Completely different responses, reactions, really. The order, that's one's a response, one's a reaction. So when we're reacting, we're just like, towards something, versus when we're responding, we're a little bit more calmer about something, and we've got a little bit more rationality in our thinking processes when we're responding rather than reacting. So catastrophizing, really common one that we all engage in. And like I said, some things may trigger us more than others. We may catastrophize certain events more than other events in our lives. Another one, a really common one, is black and white thinking. So sometimes known as all or nothing thinking. So this is when we struggle to find sort of balance and grey in our thinking. It's either all this or all that. It's all good or it's all bad. It has to be this way or it's no way at all. And when we have really rigid thinking, that's what we would call that. A lot of these unhelpful thinking styles are actually quite rigid in their structure. What I mean by that is when we adhere to really strict, and I'm using lines, it's like these strict lines and these strict beliefs about the way things have to be done, and they show up in our thoughts and in our behaviours, there's no room for movement. There's no flexibility. And let me tell you, you're going to come up against some pretty heavy stuff in your life and some light stuff. Life's going to go up and down. And if you continue using these strategies which are very harsh and inflexible, how is that going to go in your life? What tends to happen is that you're potentially always engaged in some sort of conflict. You're always kind of fighting with someone, or you're always fighting with yourself because it has to be this way. Versus when we're a little bit softer in our thinking, when we're more flexible, we might still find it irritating and annoying. Of course, there's no problem with that, and that's a very human response. But instead of going, well, it has to be this way, we're then able to, when we're more flexible, we're able to kind of go, I would like it to be that way, but I'm hearing what they're saying, or I'm looking at the situation, and I think it's unlikely. So do I need to compromise? Do I just need to have some time to think about this? Do I need to have some space? Do I need to look at the other side here? And kind of come to a different conclusion. Versus it has to be this way or it can't be any other way. And look, a lot of these unhelpful thinking styles are very common and sort of louder in people and in times of our lives when we're really depressed and when we're really anxious. Anxiety is huge. I think it's just rampant in our society. It just looks different in different people. And when we are very rigid in our thinking, we're trying to control things so much. And there's this harshness and criticism because underneath it all, we're just really anxious. We're really scared. Really, if we were to dig away at those layers. And it's frankly, it's too scary to soften things up, to be a bit flexible, to risk a different way of thinking about things or a different way of doing things, or it's just too scary or too hard to be compassionate towards ourselves because we don't know what's on the other side. And things have kind of always worked for me this way. They actually probably haven't, but we kind of tell ourselves that so we don't have to change, and change is hard. 100%. It's hard. And the more, though, we're able to be willing to be a little bit more flexible in our thinking, to take some self-responsibility in the way we do things, the way we think about things, take responsibility for our mistakes, be kind and compassionate towards ourselves when we do make mistakes, the better our lives will be. It really will. But you have to sort of shift the focus from excessive kind of outside, what's everyone doing, and I have to measure up to X, Y, Z, to, what? How am I doing? All that matters, all I can really control is me and what I'm doing in my little world, in my little bubble kind of thing. And that really just shifts the energy from quite harsh to a lot of a softer kind of approach. Kind of really rabbiting on and going off on tangents here, but it's just such a great topic. I just love it. So yes, we look at the inner critic, we look at thinking styles, cognitive distortions, we look at what they are, we look at how to change them, we look at how to work with irrational beliefs, what they're about, the difference between a fact and a belief being a thought process. A lot of this, a lot of what I'm talking about is about becoming more self-aware. So, and mindfulness is a big way to become more self-aware. When we're kind of not in tune with ourselves and we're kind of ignorant to our own thought processes, and we're not aware of our ways and our patterns, we kind of blindly stumble along in life, and a lot of stuff happens and we don't know why things keep happening to us. It very much feels like things keep happening to me. The world is out to get me. I'm being punished for some reason. When we don't have that awareness, it's very easy to fall into those kind of traps. Awareness, when we become more aware of ourselves, when we gain more insight and often come into counselling and having therapy, that's one way of gaining some more insight into your world of what's happening. There are many other ways as well. Talk therapy is just one technique. When you choose to do that, when you essentially take that responsibility to kind of look at what's happening in my head, what's happening in my life, what's really going on here for me, we start to see things, we start to notice our ways and our patterns and our little traps that we fall into. And then with that awareness and insight, it offers us a choice. So instead of kind of blindly walking along and living your life, when you have that increased awareness, you might still repeat certain patterns, and that may continue for quite some time until the brain learns to do something different. I've lost my train of thought. When we become more, what was I going to say about that? Aware. Choice. We have more choice points. And like I said, that does take time, but over time, when you start to become aware of your thoughts and your irrational thinking and some funky beliefs and some unhelpful thinking styles and the way you criticize yourself, you're able to start to learn to catch yourself in the moment of doing that. And this is very similar to, say you're trying to break down what's happening between me and my partner when we argue a lot, right? And if you both become more aware of your pattern, often there's a cycle in this example of a couple fighting. Often there's a typical kind of pattern that forms. When a couple becomes much more aware of that pattern, they're able to kind of jump in mid-pattern, mid-argument, and go, we're doing it again. And this is the same for us in our thinking and the way we do things. So say you are triggered by, say, a particular family member, big one, very common, and every time you see this person, you always argue with them. And then after the argument, you always go and, have 4 G&Ts. Or you go and get KFC or something. I don't know, whatever the example is. So you're kind of really stuck in a pattern there. So once you become more aware of that, and you're like, wait a second, every time I see that person, I tend to argue with them, and then I tend to go and do this. Or in a couple, when you go, wait, whenever we get on this roundabout, this merry-go-round, here we are. We this is what happens. We do this. We get on this merry-go-round, roundabout, and then you act this way, I act this way. When you become more aware of that, you're like, ooh, I'm here. This is it. I'm doing it in this moment. And often that takes, like I said, time. It takes a lot of practice. Mindfulness very, very much helps with that, because we learn to kind of slow things down. We learn to be able to catch ourselves in that moment. And so being mindful, being compassionate towards ourselves helps us to do that. It helps to teach us to notice ourselves and our little ways and processes, to wake up to them. Can be quite challenging, can be quite confronting, I won't lie to you. It is hard. It is hard to put yourself under a microscope and go, gosh, I'm really quite a horrible person when I say those things, or when I do that, or when I yell at my kid that way, or when I have a go at my partner, or when I attack that poor person at the shops. is an icky process, you know. The goal, you know, the outcome though, hopefully is worth it, having much greater understanding of yourself and to be fundamentally kinder to yourself. And I can tell you, when you are kinder to yourself, you are kinder to everyone out there in the world. And that's very much what we need now in the world, more than ever. So I cover that. Also in self-compassion, in the course, I go into affirmations, how to create some little affirmations for yourself. I do also talk about affirmations not being for everyone. Some people are like, affirmations are really silly, you know, they don't work. And that's okay, you know. I very much in this course am very mindful of encouraging people to do what works for them. I'm just facilitating the space and offering some suggestions, but you really have to listen to yourself and what is going to work for you. We talk a little bit about the difference between validation of ourselves and other people versus toxic positivity. I really like that phrase, toxic positivity. So there's no genuineness when we are excessively positive and excessively happy, and, you know, when somebody's struggling or they've had a breakup or something, say, and you're like, you'll be right, just get over it, plenty of efficiency, keep your chin up, you know. I do talk a little bit about that and how unhelpful that can be, and the difference between that and genuinely validating and supporting yourself, and then creating some little affirmations from that that are yours, that you resonate with, that don't fall into this kind of sugary trap of that toxic kind of over-the-top positivity, which invalidates us and dismisses us instead of learning to really be with ourselves. Also in the self-compassion course, and I think I believe what is a really important part of self-compassion is boundaries, and learning about boundaries, psychological boundaries. There's a few different types of boundaries and why they're important. So just in a nutshell, boundaries, you know, psychological boundaries I'm talking about, help you determine what you will and won't let into yourself, and sort of what you will and won't share with others of yourself. So boundaries are about how much you interact with people, who you interact with, how much you share with them about yourself or your time, how much time you give other people. This is a really big one for many people, particularly women. Tend to be very people-pleasing. We give a lot. We just want to help everyone, and we don't help ourselves. And often that's because our boundaries aren't good. We really struggle with saying no to people without feeling guilty. I've got to tell you, guilt is just along for the ride there. The trick and the challenge is to learn to, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, learn to regulate your feelings and to manage those feelings of guilt that come up with saying no when you set a boundary with someone. In the same, and also in that vein, and in the module 1, when I look at boundaries and look at how to set boundaries and the feelings that come up when setting boundaries. There's the guilt at saying no, but also we look at the resentment and anger that comes up when we keep saying yes, when we mean no, when we really I don't have time for this, or I'm so sick of helping this person, but I feel obligated to say yes, and I'm a bad person if I say no, and I'm going to feel guilty, so I'm just going to say yes. Well, you know, I'm sure you can relate to that. So we really pull that apart and we look at that, and we look again about that importance of learning to regulate emotions. And again, I would say practicing mindfulness, any acts of compassion and kindness towards ourselves is one way to do that. Going to therapy is another way to learn how to regulate your feelings. Often people who have had tricky childhoods and families where there was chaos or high dysfunction, or family members who really struggled with their emotions, we never learned how to do that. We might have seen complete suppression of emotions, or just emotions blowing up all over the place, constant kind of arguments and loud stuff and people yelling, all this kind of stuff. And we never really had a good role model of someone learning to manage their feelings really well. So that really does underline a lot of human contentment. You know, if you're able to regulate your emotions pretty well and you're pretty in touch with yourself, you're pretty aware of what's going on, you're pretty kind and compassionate towards yourself when the shit hits the fan kind of thing, the better your life will be. The more content and satisfied your life will be. It won't necessarily always be happy. I think that's quite an unrealistic goal to have. I've just got to be happy. I've just got to be happy. That can, I think, really set us up for failure in a lot of ways. But when we go for this goal of, I just want to be pretty content, and I want to be able to kind of work through things as they come up without it throwing me against the wall and wiping me out for weeks on end, you know. So we go into that a little bit as well. Particularly around boundaries and how having healthy boundaries is a very, very important act of self-compassion, and sorting out what's yours and what's someone else's stuff, and how do you go about doing that? Because if you've been doing things a certain way for so many years, say, and you've always said yes when you actually want to say no, you probably don't even know how to do that, or what that even looks like. So we cover a little bit of that in the course content. I'm just going to give you some examples of what boundaries sound like. So that might be learning to say things to yourself and changing some of your beliefs. So something like, it's not my job to make other people happy. Boundary set. Boop, this is me. I'm responsible for me and my happiness, mostly. Sometimes things happen outside of ourselves that I'm not responsible for, but it's not my job to make you happy, say. Another example there, nobody has to agree with me. That's a really big one too. I think if you're very much a people pleaser and you want everyone to like you all the time, that sets you up for saying yes to everything and kind of having really terrible boundaries with people. Whereas when you kind of accept that nobody has to agree with you all the time, nobody has to like you all the time, that kind of frees you up to live a life not so fearful and anxious. Another example is okay to say no. That's a big one. It might take a long time to practice that. Another one, it's not my job to take responsibility for other people. It's kind of similar to making other people happy. It's not my job to fix others, this kind of stuff. So we start to really change with when we start working with boundaries, we start to really change and flip kind of some beliefs that we might have had around whose job is it, you know, between two people or more people, whose job is it to take care of that person? Why am I responsible for that person's happiness? And you're not. Everyone is ultimately responsible for ourselves. So we look at boundaries and what they are, we look at what blurred boundaries are, we look at the different types of boundaries, the struggles that come into place when people set boundaries. We look at trying to juggle that seesaw of guilt versus anger and resentment. Actually, and throughout the course as well, I do get you to practice self-compassion with some mindfulness with some little meditations that I chuck in there as well. Finally in the course, before I kind of finish up, I've only got like 5 minutes or so, I cover and I end with talking about re-parenting. Another kind of big word that's kind of out there right now. What is re-parenting? And so we look at that. So essentially, all re-parenting is learning to parent yourself. It acknowledges that for many of us, the way we were parented might not have been the most wonderful way to be parented. So when we start re-parenting ourselves, we start to be the person that you needed in your life when you were younger. So we can kind of see, I think you can sort of see the sense in that, but also the challenge in that, because if you have kind of incorporated and internalized a lot of voices that you heard growing up, voices I mean parents or main caregivers, role models, and those voices were pretty harsh and critical, and you've internalized them, your inner parent might be that same parent that you had growing up, pretty harsh, pretty critical, pretty attacking kind of thing. So in learning to re-parent yourself, you're learning to relate to yourself in a different way, in a very compassionate way, to kind of be that loving, nurturing parent that you might not have had when you were growing up. We look at some signs that may indicate you need to be doing some reparenting, and reparenting and boundaries are quite linked, so we have a little look at that. We look at some strategies to reparent yourself and to get in touch with your inner child. Some people kind of go, yeah, inner child, and sometimes I even think that, but ultimately that's what we're trying to do in reparenting and caring for ourselves and being compassionate towards ourselves. We're taking care of ourselves and cultivating a really different relationship with that little person that still exists inside of us, that part of us that is still young and playful and creative and spontaneous and joyful. You know, reparenting is about getting back in touch with that and allowing that space within us to come forth. It's also about very much about self-care and taking care of yourself, particularly in difficult moments in our lives with difficult feelings. We also look at how often in our lives when we're really struggling and we're feeling something pretty negative. We might be feeling really anxious or something really scared, or we might be feeling rejected or abandoned. We actually look at how a lot of that feeling in that moment actually taps into that little person inside of us and is actually activating that person. And it's not just you as an adult who might be feeling rejected and abandoned and scared. It's actually that little person inside of you. Therefore, how are you going to act towards your little person? If this was a little person in your life, a child in your life, again, like I was saying before, would you criticize them? Would you have a go at them? Would you punish them? Would you say, don't be such a sissy, just come on, suck it up, stop crying, what's your problem, you know? And if that happened to you growing up, you know, how was that for you and how is that working for you now? When we learn to reparent ourselves, we completely change the words and feelings around that. So we look in the course, we look at the feelings and challenges that you might be feeling as an adult and how actually they're connected and related to emotional responses that your inner child is also having at that moment in your life, and then how to respond to that emotion and to that emotionally needy place. And children are needy, and our inner child, sorry, I hope you don't have more than one inner child, you might have, you know, that's whatever, how to respond to that place of emotional neediness. And again, you know, people hear that word needy and they just kind of run for the hills, like, they're so needy, you know, kind of thing. Kids, when we think about children, we think about babies, man, they are 100% needy, they are fully dependent on us. And the only way they have to communicate us is through their emotions and through their bodily responses. You know, and that kind of lessens over time. They become toddlers and young children and older children. But they still are very dependent and needy on us, and never more so than in their feelings and their emotions, and how we deal with their feelings and emotions and support them through that and validate their feelings is how they'll kind of grow up to be as adults, and how in turn they'll treat themselves as an adult. So when we reparent, we're trying to redo some of this stuff. We're starting to learn how to validate ourselves and to really connect with that little tiny vulnerable place within us that is freaking out. It freaks out sometimes, and yet often we kind of want to shut it up, we want to suppress it. We go, oh, for God's sake, this is crazy, why am I feeling this way? We kind of flip that into like, oh my gosh, you know, this is really hard for me. I need to tend to that part of myself. So we have a little look at that, how to reparent your inner child and how to bring out the inner child as well. Often as adults, we've forgotten that. We've forgotten how to play. We've forgotten how to have fun, or forgotten how to have fun without the help of, say, alcohol or other kind of really unhealthy ways. So I talk a little bit about that, how to kind of engage with that and get connected to that inner child and have some fun with that. We finally ended up talking about self-care and how reparenting and self-compassion is very much about taking care of yourself. And I'm not just talking about chocolate cake and the odd bubble bath. And I love, there's a quote in the course, I'll just read it out now, a good quote that I love. True self-care is not about salt baths and chocolate cake. It is making the choice to build a life you don't need to regularly escape from. That's by Brianna Wiest. I love that quote. That makes so much sense to me. If your life is so difficult and intolerable that you need all these escapes and you need to be doing so much self-care, there's a problem with your life overall, kind of thing. I do acknowledge that when you have babies and really young children, or if you've got a family member with a disability, life can be really tough. And that's something a little bit different than what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a life that perhaps you've set up that is so overwhelming and stressed and demanding, and there's so much conflict and all this kind of stuff that really, to kind of counterbalance that, you'd be needing to eat 3 chocolate cakes a day and going to, spas every second day. That's not right, and that's telling you something, and plus that's not realistic. But the point is, we want to create a life for ourselves that we don't need to escape from, fundamentally. So when we learn to be self-compassionate and kind towards ourselves, when we have good boundaries, when we're conscious and aware of our kind of thought processes and how funky they can be, when we're aware of some of our behaviours and how we slip into some really unhelpful behaviours sometimes, and when we can have all this awareness with compassion, there's just so much scope for change and for completely redoing your life so that it becomes calmer, more contented, more satisfying, and kind of just bathed in this kindness kind of vibe about it. Beautiful way to live your life. So that's how we kind of wrap up looking at self-care and how it connects to self-compassion. I'm at the end. I've reached an hour of me talking. So if any of this sounded interesting to you, by all means jump on our website and have a look at, you go into the little tab that says what's on, and there's a little drop down box that says online groups, and you can go in there. There's another group that I talked about last week, the money group, looking at your relationship with money. So we have 2 groups available to purchase. Normally they're $50, now they're $25. That's for the whole course. Really good value. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch and listen to this. I hope some of it has been useful, even if you don't want to go and purchase any of the courses. I hope just the content today has given you something to think about and to practice maybe. And I will see you all next week, where I'm going to be talking about a new group we have coming up called The Artist's Way. Very much about getting in touch with your creative side and your inner child. Have a good week, everyone. Take care, and I'll see you then.